The hiss of recycled air was a familiar sound, a sterile white noise that usually meant the lull between emergencies at the hospital. But here, surrounded by the scent of expensive leather and champagne, it felt alien. Imani shifted in her seat, the soft polyester of her light blue scrubs a stark contrast to the plush cream upholstery of the first-class cabin. She had cashed in every airline mile she'd ever earned, a desperate, last-minute splurge for a flight to Tokyo to see her ailing aunt. It was either this or wait 2 days for seat and coach. Her aunt didn't have 2 days. A low, condescending laugh cut through the cabin's murmur. A man in a tailored suit, his face florid with drink, leaned toward his wife and gestured with his chin. "Must have gotten lost on her way to the back," he said, his voice just loud enough to carry. "Maybe she's here to take our blood pressure." His wife gave a tinkling, cruel laugh. "Don't be silly, darling. They have standards." Imani felt a familiar heat crawl up her neck, the kind that came with a dozen tiny cuts a day. She didn't turn. She didn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, she focused on the cool, smooth feel of the window against her temple, watching the ground crew move like ants on the tarmac below. She was a trauma nurse. She had held the hands of dying men and looked into the eyes of people on the worst day of their lives. A pair of entitled snobs on a plane were nothing. She breathed out slowly, a practiced calm settling over her. That's when she felt a shift in the cabin's atmosphere. It wasn't just the closing of the doors or the final boarding announcement. It was a change in pressure, a sudden drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Across the aisle and 1 seat forward, a man sat in perfect stillness. He hadn't been there when she boarded. He must have been the last one on. He wore a charcoal suit of such fine wool it seemed to absorb the light around it. His hands rested on his knees, one wrist adorned with a simple, brutally expensive-looking watch with a black face.
No diamonds, no flash.
Just the quiet confidence of absolute power. His hair was cut short, stark black against his pale skin. He was Japanese, his features sharp and elegant, carved from stone. But it was his eyes that held the room hostage. They were dark, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. He wasn't looking at the couple who had mocked her. He was looking at nothing, yet somehow seeing everything. He moved like the world owed him space, and the world seemed to agree. Imani told herself to look away, but her gaze snagged on the details. The single, faint scar that traced the edge of his left eyebrow. The perfect, sharp line of his jaw. The way his stillness was not passive, but predatory. He was a coiled snake in a $1,000 suit. She finally broke the contact, turning to stow her carry-on bag more securely in the overhead compartment. She stood on her toes, reaching up, and for a second, the hem of her scrub top lifted, exposing a few inches of skin at the small of her back. It was only for a moment, but in that moment, the man's empty gaze sharpened to a laser point. His focus wasn't on her skin, but on what was inked there, a small, delicate tattoo of a single black rose, its stem wrapped in thorns, rendered in intricate, shadowy detail. It was a relic from another life, a mistake she'd been trying to outrun for 5 years. To anyone else, it was just a flower. To the man across the aisle, it was a brand. His entire body went rigid. The glass of water in his hand remained perfectly still, but a flicker of something, disbelief, recognition, danger, flashed in his dark eyes. He didn't just see the tattoo. He read it. The plane began its taxi down the runway. The condescending man was now complaining loudly about the delay. Imani settled back into her seat, pulling her scrub top down, oblivious to the silent, seismic shift that had just occurred across the aisle. She closed her eyes, praying for a smooth, uneventful flight. The prayer went unanswered. An hour into the flight, a choked gasp echoed through the quiet cabin. The businessman who had mocked her was clutching his chest, his face turning a terrifying shade of purple. His wife screamed. A flight attendant rushed over, her face a mask of professional panic. "Is there a doctor on this flight?" she called out, her voice tight. Imani was already unbuckling her seatbelt. The world snapped into focus, the cabin noise fading into a hum. This was her space. This was what she knew. "I'm a trauma nurse," she said, her voice calm and steady as she moved into the aisle. "What's happening?" The man was sweating profusely, his breathing ragged and shallow. Classic signs of a myocardial infarction. Imani knelt beside him, her fingers immediately going to his wrist to find a thready, rapid pulse. "I need the emergency medical kit.
Now.
And get the pilot on the line. We need to know the nearest airport for an emergency landing." She worked with a clean, surgical efficiency that silenced the cabin. She administered aspirin, hooked him up to the portable defibrillator, and inserted in 4 with a practiced ease that was mesmerizing to watch. She spoke in low, reassuring tones to his hysterical wife while her hands moved with a life of their own, competent and sure. She didn't notice the eyes that followed her every move. Kaito watched her. He saw past the blue scrubs. He saw the way she commanded the scene, her voice never rising, her focus absolute. He saw the way she moved under pressure, not with panic, but with a lethal calm he had only ever seen in his own soldiers. He had seen men with that kind of focus kill for him. He had never seen a woman with it save a life in front of him. And he saw the ghost of that black rose, a symbol he knew intimately. It was the mark of the Kurosawa Kai, his clan. It wasn't given to soldiers or enforcers. It was a mark of honor, bestowed only upon those who had saved the life of a sworn member, an act that bound them to the clan with a debt of blood. It was a secret, a sigil almost no one outside the inner circle even knew existed. Who was this woman? This black nurse from America, who moved like one of his own, and wore a mark he hadn't seen in years. The man was stabilized, his breathing evening out as the pilot announced they were diverting to Anchorage. Imani sat back on her heels, the adrenaline starting to recede, leaving a familiar exhaustion in its wake. The wife was sobbing her thanks, clutching Imani's hand. Imani finally returned to her seat, her body aching. As she sat down, a low voice cut through the air, meant only for her. "You have done that before," Kaito said. It wasn't a question. Outside of a hospital. Imani froze. She turned to look at him, truly look at him, for the first time. His dark eyes were fixed on her, analytical and deeply unsettling. There was no gratitude in them, only a cold, hard appraisal. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Her heart, which had been steady through the whole emergency, began to hammer against her ribs. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "The way you assess the threat, the way you control the scene, the way you ignored the noise." He leaned forward just a fraction, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "That is not taught in nursing school." The cabin lights seemed to dim around them, creating an intimate, terrifying bubble. He knew. He didn't just suspect something, he knew. The tattoo wasn't a random connection. It was a key, and he held the lock. "I'm just a nurse," she repeated, her voice tighter this time. "And the rose?" he asked, his gaze flicking down toward her back, though it was covered. "Is that just a flower?" The blood drained from her face. She felt exposed, stripped bare at 30,000 feet with nowhere to run. The life she had so carefully built, the quiet, normal existence of shifts and charts and saving people the right way, was about to be torn apart by a man with eyes that saw too much. The plane began its descent into Anchorage, but Imani knew her world was already in a free fall. In Anchorage, the businessman was whisked away by paramedics, his wife trailing behind them, still offering tearful, effusive thanks. The airline arranged for the first-class passengers to wait in a private lounge while they prepared a new plane. The lounge was quiet, the air thick with the aftermath of crisis. Imani found a corner, trying to make herself small, but she could feel his presence across the room like a physical weight. He approached her, moving with that same silent, deliberate grace. He didn't sit, but stood before her, a silent monolith in a perfect suit. He placed a bottle of water on the table beside her. "A debt is owed," he said simply. "Not by him to you, by me." Imani looked up, confused. "I don't understand." "The rose," he said, his voice low. "It signifies a life saved. A life bound to the Kurosawa Kai. You wear the mark, so you know our ways. A life for a life. You saved a man in my presence. Under my watch. That makes the debt mine to carry. Her mind raced.
Kurosawaki.
The name hit her like a punch to the gut. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 5 years. Not since the night she'd found a young Japanese man bleeding out in an alley behind the free clinic where she volunteered. He'd been stabbed, left for dead. She'd saved him, using her skills and a stolen suture kit. He never told her his name, but a week later, an old man had found her, pressed a thick envelope of cash into her hand she refused, and told her she had earned an honor. He'd taken her to a tattoo artist in a hidden room, a man who had inked the black rose onto her back. He told her it was a mark of protection, a symbol that she was under the clan's watch, forever. She'd thought it was a strange, dramatic thank you. She'd taken the first nursing job she could find 3,000 miles away the next month. She never thought she'd see any of them again. That was a long time ago, she whispered, her throat dry. It has nothing to do with me anymore. Nothing is ever over, he corrected her gently. He gestured to a faint, silvery scar just above his temple, the one she'd noticed earlier. Some debts are written in ink, others in blood. They all must be paid. He looked away for a moment, his gaze distant, and a flicker of something raw and unguarded crossed his face. I once failed to protect someone who wore that mark. A strategist in my organization. My partner. Her name was Akari. An ambush. A mistake in my calculations. I carry the shame of her loss every day. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and unexpected. He wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a man haunted by failure. A man who understood the weight of the symbol on her skin better than she did. He saw her not as a nurse, but as a ghost of someone he had lost. That's when two men entered the lounge. They didn't look like passengers. They were dressed in cheap suits that didn't fit right, their posture stiff, their eyes scanning the room with a predatory focus. They weren't looking for a flight. They were hunting. Kaito saw them, and his entire demeanor shifted. The quiet intensity became a lethal stillness. He subtly moved, placing himself between Imani and the entrance. "Stay behind me," he murmured, his voice a blade of ice. Imani's training, the instincts she'd tried to suppress for years, screamed at her. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was a threat. She could run. She could scream for security. She could pretend she hadn't seen the hard outlines of weapons under their jackets. She could go back to being just a nurse. But she saw the look in Kaito's eyes. The same haunted look from when he spoke of Akari. He was preparing to die to protect a stranger because of a tattoo. And in that moment, she made a choice. She didn't run. She stayed. The men approached, their hands reaching inside their jackets. Kaito moved first. It wasn't a fight. It was a disassembly. He flowed around the first man's clumsy lunge, his hand striking the man's throat with brutal precision. The man collapsed, gagging. The second man pulled a ceramic knife, lunging for Kaito's side. Imani didn't think. She acted. She grabbed the heavy, metal base of a floor lamp beside her chair and swung it with all her might into the back of the second man's knees. His legs buckled with a sickening crack. The lunge went wild, and it gave Kaito the fraction of a second he needed. He disarmed the man and neutralized him with a swift finality that made Imani's stomach clench. It was over in 5 seconds. The lounge was silent, save for the gasping of the two men on the floor. Kaito stood over them, breathing evenly. He had a deep gash on his forearm, blood dripping onto the pristine carpet. He looked at Imani, his eyes dark and unreadable. He saw the lamp clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. He saw her face, pale but resolute. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't hidden. She had fought. Airport security swarmed in, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. Kaito spoke to them in rapid, authoritative Japanese. He produced an identification that made the lead officer bow his head slightly and back away, gesturing for his men to stand down. He was untouchable. He turned back to Imani, grabbing her arm. "We are leaving," he said, his voice low and urgent. He pulled her through a side door, away from the chaos, and into a private corridor. The forced proximity was dizzying. His scent filled her senses, sandalwood and the sharp, metallic tang of his own blood. "Your arm," she said, her nurse's instincts kicking in. "It's deep." "It is nothing," he dismissed, but she saw the grimace of pain he tried to hide. He was losing more blood than he was letting on. In the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, his face looked paler. She saw his mortality, the vulnerability beneath the cold, controlled exterior. The thought of him bleeding out, of losing him here in this sterile hallway, sent a jolt of unexpected fear through her. They reached a service elevator. As the doors closed, sealing them in the small, metal box, he finally leaned against the wall, a wave of dizziness washing over him. "I need to stitch that," she said, her voice firm. "It won't close on its own." He looked at her, a strange light in his eyes. "You are not afraid." "I'm terrified," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But you're bleeding out, and that's a problem I know how to solve." She tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her own scrub top to make a pressure bandage. It was a temporary fix. As she wrapped his arm, her fingers brushed against his skin. It was hot, electric. She was touching this dangerous, lethal man with a tenderness reserved for her patients. She was crossing a line she could never uncross.
To protect him, she would have to lie.
To help him, she would have to become part of his world. When his people met them on the tarmac by a private jet, she looked at the lead guard and said, with a calm authority she didn't feel, "He lost his footing during the attack. The laceration is from a piece of broken furniture. It's clean, but it needs a proper medical kit." She was an accomplice now. The lie came easily. Too easily. On his jet, soaring over the Pacific, the world outside was a blanket of darkness. Inside, the cabin was a silent, tense operating theater. Imani worked under the bright glare of an overhead light, a proper medical kit open beside her. She cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but efficient. Kaido sat perfectly still, watching her face, not the needle piercing his skin. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the unspoken truths of the last few hours. The tattoo, the attack, her choice to help, her crossing a line. "The rose is for those who save a life bound by oath," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You just saved mine." She paused, the needle hovering over his skin. She finally looked up, meeting his intense gaze. Their faces were inches apart. "I thought that part of my world was dead," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Buried with her. With Akari, it wasn't a declaration of love. It was something deeper, more dangerous. It was a confession of connection, an admission that she had resurrected a part of him he thought was gone forever. He was telling her she mattered in a way no one had since the woman he'd failed to protect." She finished the last stitch, her hands steady despite the tremor in her soul. She told herself it was survival instinct, this strange pull toward him. She was lying to herself. As they began their descent into Tokyo, one of his men approached with a tablet. He showed Kaido a message. Kaido's face hardened, the brief flicker of vulnerability gone, replaced by glacial cold. "What is it?" Imani asked. He looked at her, and his expression was grim. The attack was not random. It was the Ishikawagumi, a rival clan. "They know I wasn't alone. They have your description. They know a black woman in nurse's scrubs helped me." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Landing in Tokyo doesn't end the threat. For you, it's just the beginning. You are a target now." The choice he gave her as they disembarked onto the private airstrip was not a choice at all. She could walk away, try to disappear into the vastness of Tokyo, and wait for the Ishikawagumi to find her. Or she could go with him. She looked at his bandaged arm, her handiwork. She looked into his dark eyes, which held the promise of both a cage and a sanctuary. Her old life, the quiet life of a nurse, was already a ghost. It had vanished the moment she'd swung that lamp. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice clear and certain. The ambush came in the parking garage. It was brutally fast. The squeal of tires, the shatter of glass, the percussive blast of gunfire. Kaido's men formed a perimeter, returning fire with cold, Practiced efficiency. Kaido shoved Imani behind him, his body a shield, pulling her toward an armored sedan. It was chaos, a whirlwind of noise and violence. But Imani's mind was sharp. She saw things in flashes. The muzzle flash from behind a concrete pillar. The way Kaido moved, never wasting emotion. A deadly dance through a storm of bullets. Then she saw it. A blind spot. One of the enemy soldiers, moving along the far wall, was circling around. He had a clear shot at Kaido's back. Kaido was focused on the threat in front of them, pushing her toward the car door his man held open. He wouldn't see it in time. There was no time to shout a warning. Imani's eyes darted around, landing on a red fire extinguisher mounted on the pillar beside her. Without a second thought, she broke from Kaido's grip, pulled the pin, and aimed the nozzle. A thick, white cloud of CO2 blasted the gunman in the face just as he raised his weapon. He screamed, dropping his gun to claw at his blinded eyes. The sound made Kaido turn. He saw the neutralized threat, saw Imani standing there with the extinguisher, her face set in a look of fierce determination. He didn't hesitate. He raised his own weapon and fired twice. The threat was gone. He grabbed her, half pulling, half lifting her into the sedan. The doors slammed shut, encasing them in a sudden, deafening silence as the car sped away, leaving the sounds of the firefight behind. Adrenaline coursed through her veins. Her hands were shaking. She had just helped kill a man, the nurse who saved lives. The irony was a bitter pill in her throat. The cost of her choice was the woman she used to be. In the dim light of the car, Kaido reached across the seat, not to comfort her, but to take her hand. His grip was firm, grounding. He looked at her, his eyes full of a raw, startling intensity. "You are not a liability," he said, his voice rough. "You are a weapon." For a man like him, she realized, it was the most profound declaration he could make. It wasn't about her beauty or her kindness. It was an acknowledgement of her strength, her survival instincts, her value in his world. It was his version of "I see you," his version of "I need you." The car swept through the glittering streets of Tokyo, finally arriving at a sleek, modern skyscraper that pierced the clouds. They rode a private elevator to the penthouse. The doors opened onto a space of minimalist perfection, dark wood floors, glass walls, and a panoramic view of the city's endless lights. It was beautiful, sterile, and a gilded cage. He walked to a bar and poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. He handed one to her. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, a spark of heat in the cool, quiet room. She walked to the vast window, looking down at the sprawling metropolis. It was a world away from her quiet apartment, her ordered hospital life. She was a stranger here, in a strange land, bound to a strange and dangerous man. He came to stand behind her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical weight, a claim. "You asked me on the plane why I was going to Tokyo," he said, his voice a low murmur beside her ear. "This is it. I burned down my enemies' empires to protect what is mine." His hand came up, his fingers gently tracing the spot on her back, through the thin fabric of her scrubs, where the black rose was hidden. It was a touch that sealed her fate, a brand more permanent than any ink. "And you, Imani," he said, his voice dropping to a possessive whisper that vibrated through her entire being. "You are now mine to protect." She didn't answer. She just stared out at the glittering, dangerous city below, the whiskey glass cool against her palm, and felt the weight of his claim settle over her, not as a chain, but as an anchor in a world that had suddenly, irrevocably become hers.